This story shares the experience of a woman who considered divorce due to the harsh treatment she received from her grandmother-in-law, which was a carryover from the grandmother-in-law's treatment of her own daughter-in-law. Recently, however, the grandmother-in-law has started to change her behavior. Let's find out what happened. Before we start, please like and subscribe. It really supports our channel.
Hello. I am a woman in my 30s who got married at a relatively young age and seriously considered divorce because of the traditional living situation imposed by my grandmother-in-law, something even my in-laws didn't enforce. Our family home included 3 generations living together: my husband's grandparents and his parents. My mother-in-law is quite a formidable woman, who often said, "All this is because of the grandmother-in-law," indicating the tough times she went through under her mother-in-law's roof. This is something even my husband acknowledges. Although my husband didn't have a great relationship with his grandmother due to her treatment of his mother, he had a soft spot for her because she was very fond of him, her grandson. The traditional living situation began when my mother-in-law became pregnant with her first daughter, my sister-in-law. She moved into the family home due to the pregnancy before marriage. Once it was known the baby would be a girl, the grandmother-in-law started treating my mother-in-law poorly, almost like a servant. In fact, after my sister-in-law was born, the grandmother-in-law never once held her granddaughter. Can you imagine a grandmother behaving this way? 2 years later, when my husband, the second child, was born, the dynamics changed completely. My grandmother-in-law only showed affection towards my husband, having always treated my sister-in-law, who was seen as less favored from a young age, quite differently. Despite this, my sister-in-law must have felt the subtle discrimination deeply. Of course, I was unaware of these details when I married into the family. When I first visited my husband's family, I noticed that my grandmother-in-law didn't seem to take a liking to me, but I never imagined that I would end up being subjected to traditional daughter-in-law duties. After getting married, we settled near my husband's family home, starting our married life in an apartment owned by my in-laws. The issue was, despite both of us working, my grandmother-in-law would insist we come over for dinner daily. Initially, I thought she was fond of me and wanted to see her grandson and his wife, which made me respond positively to her invitations, especially since I had lost my own grandparents early and longed for that grandmotherly affection. However, it turned out that "come over for dinner" meant come over to prepare dinner. Upon my arrival, I was greeted with a new apron, and my grandmother-in-law would ask me to cook dinner. My in-laws, who ran a business together, were not home at the time. My husband would just sit in the living room, watching TV with his grandmother, as if it was the most natural thing. Honestly, I was so taken aback that I barely remember how I managed to prepare the meal. Thankfully, my mother-in-law had left some side dishes in the fridge which helped. I just made some rice and soup to go along with them. Sitting there with my grandmother-in-law and husband, I felt completely isolated. The conversation mostly revolved around my husband's work and general inquiries about each other's well-being, with little room for me to chime in. I ended up just eating and returning home, feeling quite out of place. It felt like my grandmother-in-law was calling too frequently to simply be out of boredom from being alone at home. I work full-time during the week, and with her calling us 3 or 4 times a week, it felt like we had no life of our own. There were days right after work when I would turn off my phone and ignore her calls on purpose. But what was the use? If I didn't answer, she would just call my husband instead. After living this way for about a month, I was exhausted. Between hosting a housewarming party for family, friends, and acquaintances, and attending to my grandmother-in-law, my husband and I had no time to ourselves. Luckily, on the days my mother-in-law intervened, we could rest. She knew exactly what was going on with her mother-in-law and would tell me not to come over. But it was futile when my husband wanted to see his grandmother and would go to his parents' house anyway. I was so tired that I would spend the entire weekend just sleeping. I couldn't take it anymore and finally spoke to my husband about it. If you want to see your grandmother, go by yourself. I'm going to rest at home. I'm not going to the in-laws to cook dinner anymore. My husband seemed not to understand why I was upset, saying, "But you liked my grandmother too. We've been getting along fine until now. Why suddenly change?" It was frustrating, not knowing if he was pretending not to understand or genuinely didn't get it. I didn't want to drive a wedge between him and his grandmother, so I kept my feelings to myself. When my husband wasn't around, my grandmother-in-law would say many things to me, some of which were quite hurtful. If I ever got the seasoning wrong in a soup, she'd ask, "Didn't your family teach you even this?" Or if I was cutting fruit incorrectly, she'd sigh and say, "Our Minsuk husband's name, pseudonym ended up with you. Tuskus." She only make these comments when my husband was not present. It seemed like she knew these were things she couldn't say in front of her beloved grandson. Whenever my sister-in-law came over, my grandmother-in-law would embarrass us together, saying things like, "Just as I thought, girls can't do it." But my sister-in-law would always grab my hand and look at me, with eyes asking if I was okay. I often felt deeply hurt and wondered why I had to be treated this way. But what could I do? She was a senior by over 50 years. I felt I had to endure, especially since my mother-in-law would stand up for me when she was present.
Returning home always brought a harsh reality check. On the days my parents expected my husband, they'd prepare seafood, which they themselves couldn't enjoy much, including sashimi, king crab, and marinated crab, all because they wanted to show love for their beloved son-in-law. Yet here I am at my in-laws, reduced to serving meals and tea to my grandmother-in-law. When she and my husband are around, I can hardly tell if the food is going into my mouth or my nose. I feel so sorry and embarrassed towards my parents that I just let time slip by without saying anything. I've even talked to my husband about it, asking if he thinks it's too much. But every time, he gets furious, claiming I'm insulting his family. I've tried giving him the cold shoulder for almost a month, but nothing changed. That naturally led me to not even considering starting a family soon, despite wanting to have children. My grandmother-in-law, oblivious to these inner conflicts, bluntly criticized me, asking if there was something wrong with me for not having any news of a pregnancy after more than a year of marriage. My mother-in-law, hearing this, cut her off, saying, "Mother, these days, not everyone gets married just to have kids. Let the kids handle their own business. At this point, my sadness started turning into annoyance, and that annoyance into anger. Just hearing about my grandmother-in-law would set me off. And then one day, everything exploded. My husband and I contribute equally to a joint account for living expenses. We each put in 1 million won and use it to pay for loans, interests, utilities, groceries, etc. Whatever is left, we use as personal allowance or freely spend on giving our parents some money or saving. My husband looked particularly weak and was restlessly pacing one day. I asked him, "What's the matter? Is something going on at work?" But he didn't respond. After a few days of silence, he suddenly blurted out, "Can you lend me $30,000? He asked me not to question or argue, just to lend him the money. Naturally, I said, "I can't just lend you money without knowing what it's for. Tell me what's happening." At that, he snapped at me and stormed out. Predictably, he ran straight to his parents' house. Soon after, his grandmother, furious, demanded I come over immediately. Seeing this as an opportunity to clear the air, I went to their place. When I arrived, the whole family was there. My husband was kneeling on the floor, and his parents looked angry. I cautiously sat next to him. Then his grandmother turned to me and scolded, "Can't you take care of your husband without causing such trouble?" Confused, I replied, "What? Please tell me what's going on. I have no idea." Then, sighing deeply, my mother-in-law said, "Didn't you know? He lost some money in an investment?" It was the first I'd heard of it, and my husband avoided my gaze. Seeing this, his grandmother slapped the floor with her hand and scolded me, "Why are you glaring? It's something that can happen to a man. Can't you support him in at least this?" In this heated moment, my husband clung to his grandmother, pleading, "Grandma, don't be too mad. She didn't know." Unable to hold back, I said, "Grandma, I didn't even know about the investment. How can this be my responsibility when he's gone into debt?" My mother-in-law joined in, "Mother, it's not something that can be solved by just covering it up. The debt is as much as $50,000. It turned out my husband planned to borrow $30,000 from me and the remaining $20,000 from his parents." Hearing the amount, his grandmother was shocked. She asked my husband, "Is that true?" But what could he say? He just kept his mouth shut. While doing so, she exclaimed, "Oh, dear, what were you thinking? What were you planning?" as she vigorously patted my husband on the shoulder and back. Honestly, watching this, I felt relieved thinking that if the amount had been smaller, I would have been blamed without question. At that moment, the debt of $50,000 didn't seem to bother me much. So, in the midst of that chaos, I declared, "I want a divorce. I can't live like this." The announcement shocked his grandmother and parents. I told them, if he continues like this, it won't just be me, any woman he meets might end up divorcing him. He's still a kindergartner in his grandmother's arms with no concept of economics. Please, continue to coddle him. I can't do it. And with that, I left. My sister-in-law followed me out, not to stop me, but to wipe my tears and snot, hug me, and say, "You've been through a lot. Sister-in-law, you really have suffered. Go home and rest well." She even gave me a ride home. That day, I slept soundly without a single thought. After crying myself to sleep, I woke up to find my husband's parents and grandmother at my doorstep. When I opened the door, there was my husband, a complete mess, being dragged into the house by his father by the scruff of his neck. While doing so, the grandmother burst into tears, gripping my hand tightly and saying, "My dear, I'm so sorry. I truly am." Her apology overwhelmed me, and I cried like a child. My mother-in-law also comforted me, pulling me into a tight hug to help me calm down. In that moment, my husband knelt down and wrote a letter of promise. He vowed never to invest again and to hand over financial control to me, agreeing to live on an allowance. Additionally, his parents promised to transfer the ownership of the apartment we were living in back to me. The grandmother also apologized, saying, "I'm sorry for mistreating someone else's precious daughter." From then on, the grandmother was cautious around me. If I even started heading towards the kitchen, she would prod my husband, who would be sitting in front of the TV, to get up and do the work instead of me. "This good for nothing, sitting comfortably after squandering money," she would say. Of course, I was no longer asked to prepare meals or do any such tasks.
Some of you might think, people don't change. After all that, she's made the same foolish choice again. But I believe I still love my husband enough to forgive him. By seeing this through to the end, I'll find out whether he can change, or if he will disappoint me again.